This program interviews people who work with seniors in order to enable them to have a healthy, positive later life. Tonight I am interviewing Charles Durrett, whom we fondly call Chuck, and he is going to be talking about co-housing internationally, nationally, but especially here locally in Nevada County. So welcome, Chuck.
Thank you very much, Judy.
So how did you ever discover co-housing?
Well, I went to the University of Copenhagen for a year, 1980, 81, and on my walk to the train station each day, I noticed that there was this one place that there was a lot of neighbors who talked to each other and chatted with each other and sat down at the picnic table and discussed the issues of the day with each other. Came and went from this common building where apparently nobody lived, but everybody lived. That, in contrast to the rest of the walk where, you know, I'd walk by single-family houses and there was never anybody outside, no life between the building to speak of. Apartment buildings, there was no life between the building. Condos, there was no life between the building. And there was just this one over and over and over again where I noticed it felt more in keeping with an old-fashioned neighborhood. So one day I stopped and I asked one of the residents, I said, you know, what's going on here? And she said, well, have a seat. And she explained how her and her family decided early on that living in a high-functioning neighborhood was a priority for them. You know, everybody had their own single-family house. Everybody still took advantage of the public realm, i.e. hospitals, roads, etc. But there was this common realm where she felt that was important, and that would be, you know, very reminiscent of the neighborhoods that her and her husband had grown up in, but was very hard to find. They weren't able to find it otherwise. If they were able to buy it, they were going to just buy into a neighborhood. But they thought it was too risky. And so they, you know, via a very participatory process, they got together with a bunch of other folks and created a custom neighborhood. You know, I came to think of it as a very conservative approach to, you know, this concept of neighborhood. That is, it was important. And, you know, with demographics being what they are, mom working outside the house now, fewer kids, elderly is rarely found in neighborhoods anymore, or at least are not able to sort of intermix with the neighbors, be a part of the community like it's easy to do in co-housing. You know, if you ever go to a co-housing community, you see from the beginning that it's very child-friendly, very elderly-friendly, very people-friendly, and very pedestrian-friendly. It's designed to be able to walk from one house to another without feeling like you have to get into a car, etc. So.
Are most of the co-housing communities located near town centers? I mean, I know ours the co-housing in Nevada City is located close to downtown, and the one in Mountain View is, the one in Grass Valley is. So is that a common? You
know, it is the most common, but it's not the only, for sure. I just came back from Des Moines, Iowa, where I was last week, and the group is about 20 miles outside of town. In that case, it's a 24-unit co-housing community associated with a farm. So they're looking for people who actually want to participate in a farm as well. It depends a lot on the interests of the group, for sure.
Yeah. You've talked about certain co-housing developments have a sewing room, others have a music room, others have a pottery studio. It's tailored around the individuals who are interested in it and buying into it.
Exactly. I mean, it's a custom-made neighborhood to a large extent. And, you know, that it doesn't mean that it's not, you know, set up for whoever joins the community. I mean, people do that all the time later on, and that's fine. You know, but if you were to move into our co-housing community, you know, with a music room, you would see, well, there's a music room, and that appeals to some people and doesn't appeal to others. But across the board, you know, nobody participates in everything. I mean, I only use the music room on occasion. I use the swimming pool all the time. So, you know, people have different interests.
Yeah. So there, I know, are 120 co-housing communities in the U.S. and 4 or 5 senior co-housing?
There's 4 finished, and the 5th one will be in Grass Valley, which is a 30-unit co-housing.
Okay, so how did we get from you walking to college in Copenhagen to this point of 120 nationwide?
Well, in 1984, Katie McCammett, my wife, who I met in Copenhagen in 1980, she's an American, but we met there. In 84 and 85, we went back to write a book about Danish co-housing because we were motivated to live in a place that we thought would be conducive to raising a family. And we only wanted to have one child, and our child turned out to be very social, so it would have been nothing less than abusive, or, we would have had to have a second child so that our first one would have company. That's not uncommon. Or we'd have to invest in a TV. That's not uncommon. The average kid in America watches TV about 4.5 hours a day. So, and that's just glorified babysitting, really, but it's very deleterious, many people think, to their health and emotional well-being. So anyway, Jessie had 30 other kids right outside her front door who were brothers and sisters and who really appreciated her, and she appreciated them. So we became motivated to live in a co-housing at that time in the Bay Area, and wrote a book that came out in 1988, and that book became more or less the seminal book across the U.S. for all the folks who got involved with co-housing.
And that was called Creating Co-housing.
The current book is called Creating Co-housing, but and if you're interested at all in making a new co-housing community or even finding out more about co-housing, Creating Co-housing is the latest and greatest book about the topic. But that book was called Co-housing, A Contemporary Approach to Housing Ourselves. That was the first edition.
And we'll talk about your senior co-housing book a little bit later. Okay, so how did you end up then from the Bay Area here in Nevada County?
Well, for 20 years we lived in the Bay Area, and for 20 years I tried to convince my wife to moving back to Sierra County, where I had partially grown up when I was a kid. And she kept saying no, and finally I said, how about Nevada City? And she said, fine. So I wish I'd thought of that 20 years previously. Our work is national and international, actually. We work on co-housing projects all around the world. And it didn't really make much difference where we lived. We would have to make a few trips a year to each project, of course, and work with the group through their custom design. But we'd come back here and locals help us draw them up.
And of course, this county is so community-oriented. I know I discovered it in 1973 when I was living in Reno, and I loved the community spirit. So it's a perfect place for co-housing to happen. So you got the idea, or you heard people that were interested in a senior co-housing community. How did that all develop here in Grass Valley?
Well, there were a number of people who were interested in, moving from their ranchette somewhere in Nevada County. Top of mind, the Wolf Creek Lodge group. One family lives on 20 acres on Bitney Springs. Another family lives on, or couple, lives on 15 acres on Bitney Spring. Another woman lives alone off of Newtown, 13 acres. I mean, a lot of people end up in those scenarios in the county, and they don't necessarily make sense. These are all folks who wanted to, A, downsize, B, live closer to town, which they do. They live walking distance to Mill Street, which is lovely. But more importantly than anything else, be in a proximate situation where they weren't reliant on their automobile all the time. I mean, we're social animals. We have to have a little community somewhere, somehow, but for the most part, including seniors, it's completely dependent on our automobile, our telephone, and our date book, which is anything but spontaneous. You have to plan ahead for everything, and the time arrives. You might not feel like doing it, but you feel obligated because who knows the next time you'll see this person. So, so these are folks who wanted to live proximate. The interesting thing about the Wolf Creek Lodge is those guys, they're under construction now, but they're obviously a community already. When you see them pre-meetings or during meetings, they look like they're having a great time. And they, for the most part, are having a great time. Of course, we have to get some work done from time to time. But they're already, appreciate each other largely. And they have an open house every other weekend, so if you're interested, you should come check it out. They're very welcoming to new people.
Yeah, and I'm going to actually put on my glasses and give the phone number for that, because we didn't have that one on the screen. But if you are interested in going to an open house sometime, they're offered every other week, so the next one will be July 30th, and you can call 478-1970 to find out where it is. We know it's in Rough and Ready, and to RSVP so that they know that you're coming. So if I were to go, or someone were to go down there, would they meet everybody that is going to be living at Wolf Creek Lodge?
Probably three-quarters of the folks.
Three-quarters of
and
the
you would
people.
go on a field trip to see the site under construction. That's part of that day. And you would, find out about, what they have in common. They have a glorious common house. It's over 3,000 square foot, including a caretaker unit. So, I mean, it's not only a very smart group of people that are out of denial. I mean, they're looking long term at, actually, it turns out I might break a knee someday, and so I might want somebody living here with us so that I don't feel like I have to run off to an assisted care, which everybody always thinks is temporary and ends up being permanent kind of situation because of those rare but necessary episodes of that could be once or twice a week, but that if it's at all life threatening, you end up in an assisted care long term. So senior co-housing groups have found that the best way to stave that off is to have a situation where proximate people care about each other, know about each other, think about each other, can check in each other once or twice a week,
and actually have a caregiver on site that
right.
several people could share.
Yeah, I wouldn't want people to get the wrong idea. This group, they're thinking long term for sure, but they're extremely active.
Yes,
one of the residents bicycled to Sacramento and back a couple weeks ago, so they're serious activist people, even though that many of them are over.
Well, they're just out of denial
Exactly.
about aging, and they want community. And I think it's such a hopeful idea for the future to deal with the huge number of baby boomers coming along. This makes so much sense. So let's talk a little bit more about the community room and what happens there.
Right. Well, like in our common house, we have dinner 6 nights a week available, and people sign up for 1 or 2 nights a week, like us, maybe even 3 nights a week, and sometimes even more. But the point is that there's hardly any other mode to sustain community over time than breaking bread together. I mean, that's timeless, that's traditional. But it's also very germane to the goals of just about every co-housing group I know who, are motivated to make life more convenient, more practical, more economical, more interesting, more fun. And, somebody else cooking dinner, somebody else shopping, somebody else cleaning up. You can hardly imagine a scenario where life could be more convenient, more practical.
And of course, you all take turns doing that, right? So how many times a month does one person cook?
Well, I cook and clean up about every 5 weeks, 5 or 6 weeks. There's over 50 adults there, so it turns out to work out.
You don't have to do it too much.
Exactly. I mean, theoretically, I don't have to cook or clean up. Well, I don't have to cook or clean up any more frequent than 5 weeks. Sometimes it's 6 weeks, depending on how the rotation works. But so I mean, that's one case. I mean, we also typically co-housing communities have a workshop, for example, and it's hard pressed to find a place where it's more obvious that, in the private realm, typically you can have a little workshop in your garage or whatever, but it's not very sophisticated. Or you have a public workshop where tools go missing, tools get lost. But in co-housing, I know that I'm going to upset Jim and Joe if I leave it a mess. So there's that level of accountability because there's only 30 or 40 or 50 other adults that I have to think about. All people I know, all people that I appreciate. I used to have this saying, I don't want to upset Margaret on Thursday if I'm going to ask her to watch her kid on Friday. Yeah. So that's kind of small town kind of mentality, accountability that people feel. And, that's how co-housing got started in the U.S., where I wanted to, actually live in the Bay Area, but make a setting that felt like a small town, reminiscent of Sierra County, and across the country, group after group says, we're not really doing anything new. We're simply creating or recreating, if you will, consciously what used to happen more naturally when people lived in functioning neighborhoods in small towns. Today, unfortunately, with the scale that neighborhoods get built at by developers, etc., and our default scenario is just a ranchette in the woods somewhere, which doesn't serve anybody except maybe the farmer. They're the rancher and the farmer. That makes sense. Otherwise, here in Western Nevada County, paratransit made 60,000 trips last year for about 2,000 seniors. That's 30 trips a year to take you to the pharmacy, take you to the doctor, take you to a friend. some people say 30 trips a year for a senior, that sounds like a lot. Some people say that sounds very too few. What they only got out of the house 30 times a year, they only commune with a neighbor 30 times a year, that doesn't make sense.
Right.
But the reality is, the average senior in America watches TV 6.25 hours a day, so they are isolated. And they're isolated in a very negative way. They're watching fear-based media that makes them more paranoid than they already are. They're already vulnerable, and set them up for emotional and psychological issues around that fear. It's just unfortunate.
And I would think that living in community, they would feel much more secure too. I mean, people of all ages, you're just watching out, for your neighbors, and
much more confident, much more secure.
So let's get back to the book then. If we could have on the screen the slide of the book. There we go, the Senior Co-Housing Handbook. So tell us about this, and also how people can get a copy if they're interested.
Well, getting a copy the easiest way is probably to go to newsociety.com, the publisher, a Canadian company. Or Amazon, of course, or locally, for sure. I know that Harmony Books on Broad Street carries it. The Apple Center on Commercial Street carries it. I wouldn't be surprised if the bookseller in Grass Valley carries it. To talk about the book, basically, Katie and I have well over 20 years of experience now designing co-housing communities. I went back to Denmark to write this book alone about senior co-housing, and, visited one project after another, and tried to capsulize, what's it like and what they said. And, over and over again, I heard people talk about, one precipitating event, whether it was a, broken knee or broken hip or anything, and all of a sudden, their sense of community was compromised, and so many other aspects of their life were compromised in the absence of a functioning community, right? But I have to say that visiting those co-housing communities, what really compelled me to write the book was over and over again, I felt like these folks were having the time of their life. It reminded me very much of the college dorms, where you walk on site and you see these folks who, very few of them had jobs. They didn't have kids that they were responsible for anymore. They had time. They were about the same age, and so they're right up there in terms of priorities was having a good time, having fun, and I just haven't seen any seniors anywhere have as much fun as I have in senior co-housing.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. I never thought about, how we are in college, not working, no kids, usually. And, a lot of our orientation, yes, to learn. And, of course, that's part of co-housing, too. I'm sure people have classes together, book discussion groups and things,
but
it
goes
they
on
also
and on.
do.
You feel like if one senior knows how to make cheese, they teach everybody how to make cheese. One senior knows how to make bread, they teach everybody how to make bread. And all of a sudden you have this cross, pollination of information. You really see these seniors eldering each other. As opposed to isolated and vulnerable, they're together and really fulfilling their potential, not only as people, but as a whole community, which, 1 + 1 = 3 in co-housing all the time. I have an idea, you have an idea, and together they come up with even a better idea about how to do this or how to do that. The co-housing on the cover of the book, that group gets together every morning, every single morning, 7 days a week at 10 a.m. to go for a bicycle ride. Well, you start to see, again, they're eldering each other. Hey, if I can do this, you can do this. So, we're going to have a great time, and we'll stop at the coffee shop and we'll talk about the issues of the day. I had dinner with the seniors at my co-housing. We have 20 seniors in Nevada City a few weeks ago, and it was so interesting to me that in the course of an hour, they had completely isolated or triangulated who the best knee doctor in the county was, right? There's 3 or 4 knee doctors, and they had completely agreed on who the best one was, right? Well, that's just another 100th example of how they're eldering each other all the time, because they have dinner together. They have their own house, but they have the option of having dinner in the common house, and they do so.
So the common house is used for the meals as well as for staying around chatting after meals and community meetings.
Yeah, but they have whatever the group decides. However, predictably, they have common dinners. In ours, we have kids' room because it's intergenerational, but in senior co-housing, they have a couple guest rooms. That's typical, so the kids can come home and hang out with us for a while. The grandkids could come or hang out with us for all. That all makes it possible for people to downsize from 3-bedroom, sometimes 4-bedroom houses to 1 or 2-bedroom houses because there's this common house, sometimes 4,000 square feet, that really does supplement the private house. I mean, in essence, if you have a 1,000 square foot house in common house, in co-housing, a 1,000 square foot house, and a 4,000 square foot common house, you have a 5,000 square foot house. And people sense that. I sense that. And it's really, a supplement to the private house. A workshop, guest rooms. We do our laundry in the common house because, again, after breaking bread, you go to South America and you see all these folks doing the laundry on the common rock. That's partially for community, right? So it brings people together there. I mean, you didn't have to do it, of course, but it tends to be the place where you can buy very expensive equipment because we're sharing it,
Yes.
and we can buy, other goals percolate to the top, like living lighter on the planet, so you can buy very energy efficient appliances, you can buy very water efficient appliances, you can actually even recycle gray water at that location where it's not practical anywhere else necessarily on the development.
Do you have a community garden?
We have several community gardens, and they're very popular, partially, again, because when I go out to work on the community garden, there's people who know this technique and people who know this technique, and, especially for the elders, I don't know, something happens over 65, but growing tomatoes becomes a competitive sport, and, it doesn't pay to grow those big tomatoes if there's nobody around to appreciate it, right? So, now you have people to appreciate your tomatoes.
Yeah. Well, are there any drawbacks? I mean, what about if somebody is sort of just tired of being in community for, what happens? Can they eat in their own home? And how does somebody sort of hunker down and have some private time for a while?
Oh, yeah, sure. You don't ever have to eat in the common house at all, ever, basically. Where I live, you're obligated to cook every 6 weeks, but you don't have to eat. It turns out, over and over again, there's a lot of people who I refer to as the accidental co-housers, right? the spouse who came in kicking and screaming, and I can give you plenty of examples of that. However, after you move in, you can rarely, if ever, tell who that spouse was. The person who says, oh, that's not me, I could never do that. My father, he was the worst. He came to visit us for 10 days in our co-housing, and before that he kept saying, why do you live in your co-housing? You could have your own house, right? And I said, whatever, come visit us if you want.
Yeah.
But in any case, for 10 days, he was the dead last person to leave the common house every single night. 10 o'clock, he's looking around. Who's
there to talk to.
And he cooked dinner twice. He didn't have to cook dinner at all. And then when he went back home to Sacramento, and he lamented incessantly about how people didn't come visit him enough, and he didn't have enough company, and he didn't know his neighbors, etc. So one day I said, Dad, why don't you just move into a co-housing community? And he says, oh, no, I could never do that. What would my friends say, right? And I just said, Dad, you're 73. What are we, in high school? You're worrying about what your friends say? Figure out what works for you. So, I mean, the biggest challenge about getting co-housing built in the U.S. is all the myths that we live by, right? Our culture is such that, if you don't have your ranch yet, maybe you've done something wrong, right? Getting out of that. But in any case, I'm amazed how many times a husband, usually, it was the wife's idea to move into co-housing. Then 3 weeks later, the husband's got his feet up on the table talking about what a great idea he had. That's not terribly uncommon. Co-housing is very self-selecting, and when we did the Nevada City co-housing, we had a lawyer who was very involved with the project, and somebody who charged $200 an hour to be listened to, and when he was surprised how everybody didn't defer to his every opinion, and sometimes the woman who was making $25,000 a year had a better idea, and people appreciated that more, he was always surprised over and over, and chose not to move into the co-housing, realized it wasn't for him. You have to be a little open-minded. You can't be too, 100% ensconced, because it turns out, the most frustrating thing about co-housing is that, everybody comes to the meeting talking about whether cut the tree down or don't cut the tree down or whatever the issue is. Everybody comes to the meeting feeling like they're the smartest person in the room every time. And so it takes some time to figure out the whole co-housing math, which is 1 + 1 = 3. I have an idea, you have an idea, and together we come up with a little better idea.
Well, Chuck, we miraculously have, considering our previous technical difficulties, have gone to almost the end of the program. So what would you recommend to people who are just beginning? You know, they've watched the program, they're thinking, wow, I'd like to learn more about that. What would you recommend to our listening audience who want to learn more about co-housing?
Well, if you're interested in intergenerational co-housing, you know, the new book, Creating Co-housing, is right off the press, basically. And I feel like the publisher did a stellar job. We had a lot of help putting that together, and a lot of talent really went into that book, and it really tells the story of 20 years of experience about how to make a co-housing community.
So that's Creating Co-housing.
That's Creating Co-housing. If you're more interested in senior co-housing, or if you're even interested in seniors in general, I really feel like a lot of contributing literature in the book on senior co-housing, including the prologue by Bill Thomas, really talks about to what extent community can play a role in your well-being in your later
I agree
years.
with you. I think this book is a wonderful resource for all of us in Nevada County who work with seniors, and your philosophy is very well reflected here. So that is available at local bookstores.
It very
we'll
much
just say.
is. Yes, it's available to Apple Center on Commercial Street. As far as I know, it's available at Harmony and also the Bookseller in Grass Valley,
Great.
as well as your local library.
Okay, good. The
Yeah.
local library. Yes, we should have mentioned that. Well, Chuck, I just think you're doing such a wonderful thing nationally, and I know that we feel very lucky in this county to have you because you are so well known nationally, and we have, of course, Nevada County is just full of people like this. It's a wonderful thing to live here. But I do think that you are helping to promote our community spirit here in Nevada County, and that's, of course, what community media is all about, too. And we want to close the show by saying a great, huge thank you to our team today, Sam Mills and Adele Taylor, Diane McIntyre, and Gail Woodman, and everybody else out there that helped us kind of get this program over its previous technical difficulties and come to a successful conclusion. So thanks again, Chuck, for coming
You're welcome, and
today.
thank you very much,
Wish you
Judy.
all the
Really
very
appreciate
best.
it very much. Thanks for having me.
Good night, everyone.
Here at the One Stop Business and Career Center, we offer many services to our clients. These services include computer access for job search. We also offer high